Dan Quinn certainly is taking his time when it comes to hiring a new defensive coordinator, but to me that suggests something big is about to drop. Maybe even Karl Scott, whose team is still alive in the playoffs. What's up, everybody, and welcome into Commander's Digest. I'm your host, Karl McManus, and a lot to break down on the Commanders' defensive coordinator front, so let's start here. Looking at Jeremy Fowler down at the bottom, Bears passing game coordinator Al Harris interviewing for the Commanders' defensive coordinator job, but he's also interviewing for Green Bay's vacancy after Jeff Hafley left to take the job with the Miami Dolphins as their head coach. So moving up to what John Keim says, Quinn worked with Harris in Dallas, of course. Washington had been intent on hiring an experienced defensive coordinator / play caller, and Harris lacks that experience, but so does Karl Scott, who we'll touch on in just a second. But Jeff Ulbrich, and Brian Flores are now out, having accepted roles to stay with their respective teams, the Atlanta Falcons and the Minnesota Vikings, and the Commanders are uncertain on Raheem Morris, who of course was previously the Atlanta Falcons head coach. There are a lot of implications there, but we'll break down what John Keim had to say a little bit further, and we'll take a look at all the vacancies that have yet to been filled, and of course, head coaches that are now being hired that have yet to fill their coaching staffs out, of course. But before we break this down any further, we have to hear a word from our sponsor. I'm really excited about the Commanders defensive coordinator search, but I'm also excited about Kalshi as a sponsor. When you download Kalshi using the link in the description and use our partner code DIGESTNFL, you'll get $20 when you trade your first 100. Kalshi is the largest prediction market in the United States, and on their platform, you can trade yes or no on real life events, sports, elections, and pretty much everything. Whether you're in California, Texas, or anywhere else across the country, Kalshi is live in all 50 states. For sports fans, trade on game outcomes, playoff chances, or player performances, all on a regulated market where you can cash out anytime. Now, Commanders fans, we're in the thick of the playoffs, and like I said, some of the Commanders' defensive coordinator positions, their candidates are still alive in the playoffs. Speaking about the AFC Championship, you can trade on whether or not you think the Denver Broncos with Jarrett Stidham will beat the New England Patriots, which I don't. I'm trading yes on the New England Patriots to win this game. And then you can even go onto the NFC Championship where Karl Scott and his Seattle Seahawks are still alive. I'm not 100% sure where I land on this, but you see, if you trade yes on the Seattle Seahawks to win this game, it is a big cash out. It's a genuinely smarter way to use your sports or news knowledge, and you can cash out any time you want. Download Kalshi using the link in the description, and don't forget to use our partner code DIGESTNFL to get $20 when you trade your first 100. With all that excitement, I'm more excited to get back to the Commanders' defensive coordinator position. We mentioned already Karl Scott and Al Harris, two of the latest big proteges, big names to keep a lookout for the Commanders' defensive coordinator position. And that's all because of who the Commanders have interviewed and how those things have gone. So looking here at what Nikki Javala says, here are the candidates that the Commanders have interviewed so far. Joe Cullen, D-line coach with the Kansas City Chiefs. Brian Flores, Minnesota Vikings defensive coordinator. Of course, he signed an extension to remain with the Vikings as long as he doesn't land a head coaching position. So he is out of the Commanders defensive coordinator sweepstakes. And then you have Jonathan Gannon, former head coach with the Cardinals. So again, a guy that holds that experience as not only a coordinator in the league, but as a head coach in the league that Dan Quinn is looking for. Then you have Patrick Graham of the Las Vegas Raiders. Another name that I've personally thrown out there with more ties to the Raiders is Antonio Pierce. Then you have Al Harris, the Bears defensive back coach and pass game coordinator. Again, overlap with Dan Quinn in Dallas. We'll touch on in just a second. Karl Scott, still alive with the Seattle Seahawks in the NFC Championship, vying for the Super Bowl. We'll touch on that. And then Denard Wilson, of course, ex-Tennessee Titans defensive coordinator, and a connection with the Baltimore Ravens. But with all that being said, a lot of coaches, a lot of candidates. We mentioned Jeff Ulbrich, defensive coordinator with the Atlanta Falcons, staying put, so he's no longer in the Commanders running. And then you've got Raheem Morris, who I'm not sure the Commanders have even interviewed yet, but of course they have. He has the experience as a former head coach in the NFL, and of course, Dan Quinn loves that type of experience. But with all that being said, John Keim had some very interesting words on why the Commander search might be taking this long. Let's take a look at what John Keim said on Dan Quinn and the Commander's coordinator position. If you're a coordinator and you have multiple choices and you look at this situation here in Washington, it's like, well, what is Dan Quinn's job security here? what constitutes a scenario that puts him on the hot seat. I think that plays into this whole situation as well, potentially if you have choices. Now, again, we've mentioned all the people that have choices. We'll get to this in just a second. This is Dan Quinn on Al Harris, but let's take a look at all the Commanders candidates so far and who has options. Remember, there are still a bunch of head coaching vacancies in the NFL right now. And then there are a few defensive coordinators who have taken other jobs, specifically Jeff Hafley with the Green Bay Packers. He was their defensive coordinator, now Miami's head coach. So Green Bay has a vacancy at defensive coordinator. Remember, Al Harris is interviewing there. Then you have a guy like Robert Saleh, who just left the San Francisco 49ers. He was their defensive coordinator, just took the head coaching job with Tennessee. So not only is Tennessee in need of a defensive coordinator, but so are the San Francisco 49ers. Now, going back to what John Keim said, there are a lot of positions out there and perhaps better situations than wondering whether or not Dan Quinn will even survive the season with Washington. So you've got good jobs like San Francisco. You've got Green Bay, again, two really good defenses that need defensive coordinators. So whoever Washington ends up hiring, unfortunately, is going to be deemed as a bargain bin hire. While I don't think Al Harris and Karl Scott are those type of hires, I don't think they're bargain bin. Remember, neither of those two has experience as a defensive coordinator. But with that being said, let's break down the experience that they do have. And that is here first, looking at Karl Scott. You see a long tenure as a college coach, but just a little bit of experience in the NFL. With that being said, he is the defensive pass game coordinator for the Seattle Seahawks, and that's under a defensive head coach and Ben McDonald, and then Jayden Daniels, who is generating some interest from other teams to fill either their defensive coordinator vacancies or head coaching vacancies, considering that McDonald for the Seattle Seahawks, who is formerly a Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator. He calls the plays in Seattle. His name might be Mike McDonald. That's why I was confused for a second. Ben McDonald is a former Oriole first-round pick, Baltimore Oriole first-round pick. But that's besides the point. Jayden Daniels could be seeking head coaching opportunities or get a chance somewhere else where he is the defensive play caller. And then, of course, that could lead him to take a guy like Karl Scott along, or maybe even Seattle, if they lose Jayden Daniels, promotes Karl Scott to their defensive coordinator vacancy. But as you can see here, he's a national champion in college football, with Alabama. So he's got the experience, at least knowing what it takes to bring a team from beginning of the season to national championship or title contention, which should translate over to the NFL. As you see here in Seattle, their team on the brink of a championship berth as well. So he's got that experience, at least in college, knowing what it takes to get to the highest level. And he's coached some really good players in the NFL. There are a couple players with Seattle, Tariq Woolen, who we'll touch on more in just a second. But he's a guy that is a free agent at the end of the season, and Washington could have some interest there. There's already been rumored interest in a guy like Tariq Woolen. But moving on to, this is Al Harris, and you see a pretty long list. He is a former player in the NFL. He is a Green Bay Packers Hall of Famer. You see his time spent in Green Bay, and then he's got a dearth of coaching experience, not only in the NFL, but in college as well. You see, starting back as an intern back in 2012, of course, the overlap with Dan Quinn in Dallas. He went to the Chicago Bears to be their pass game coordinator and defensive backs coach. But this is a guy lacking defensive coordinator experience. We've touched on what Dan Quinn wants. We've seen it from Nicky Jhabvala. We've seen it from John Keim, that Dan Quinn wants a guy that has experience. And while these guys lack experience, this could be the type of situation that they're left with. Of course, interviewing for the Green Bay Packers job, he's a Green Bay Packers legend. So maybe this rules him out in Washington. But of course, he does have the overlap with Dan Quinn. And here you have it from Dan Quinn himself. You can read it. I'm just going to touch on the important points here. And this was Dan Quinn right before getting hired in Washington, or right after getting hired in Washington. You see his connection with Joe Witt Jr., which is why he brought him over to Washington. But also he learned a lot from Al Harris while the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys as well. And you've got a bunch of guys with a lot of experience. He kind of runs that same zone match scheme as as Joe Witt Jr. did, but of course, Al Harris actually playing in the NFL, he'll be better at teaching that technique. And you've seen how the Chicago Bears fared this past year in terms of their secondary, one of the better teams defensively, a very disruptive secondary, and he's a guy that still Washington has some interest in. But there's another screenshot I have in here that I wanted to touch on. Here again, Nicky Javala talking about Karl Scott as a candidate, and you see all the guys in the NFL that he has coached. Not only has he coached them in college, remember, coming from Alabama, winning a national championship there as well, but you see all the guys that have NFL experience who've made it to the NFL and have been very successful from his stint in Alabama, and as well as some of the stops that he's had in the NFL as well already. See, you see the connection with Cliff Kingsbury. He was on Cliff Kingsbury's staff at Texas Tech, so he knows some of the parlance, at least of the offense, so he can at least speak to how how things are looking offensively, coming from that David Blau system now, who, of course, spent years on the Cliff Kingsbury, but specifically focusing on the defense. Spent time at Alabama as their DB's coach, so he's overlapped with a bunch of guys that are in the NFL already, and then spent the year with the Minnesota Vikings, and then, of course, since 2022, has led Seattle's secondary. I already touched on it. Tariq Woolen is a free agent upcoming, so maybe even if Washington can land a guy like Karl Scott, his relationship with Tariq Woolen could bring him here to Washington. Washington needs a lot of help defensively, and cornerback and secondary is one of those positions that Washington needs a lot of help in. And maybe even if Karl Scott is brought to Washington, that would be huge. Not only would the hire be huge in terms of, what does that mean for Dan Quinn? He's on the hot seat, perhaps. This is a guy without experience, but of course, the relationships that Karl Scott has in the NFL could bring some very good players over to Washington. Let me know what you think of the candidates available for Washington and what maybe your thought is on why Washington hasn't been able to make a hire yet. Let me know down in the comments. And of course, as always, we'll see you next time right here on Commander's Digest.